Good evening, all. I begin the evening by a famous quote by Laurie Baker, who said, "I don't think I've ever been inspired by what other architects have done, but more by what ordinary craftsmen have done, have created." This is Kamini Singh, the moderator for today's session on traditional and vernacular architecture, reintrospecting the past and the future. The topic as such is very vast, so we have decided to limit it to four aspects of analysis. The first being understanding the chronology of evolution of traditional architecture with respect to settlements. Architect Briti Srinivas, who's the speaker for today's session, has done exhaustive work with respect to Kuwait traditional architecture, and he will be focusing on Kuwait architecture. The second aspect is understanding the factors which have influenced the built form. Third, exploring materials and construction in present and the construction techniques that have dictated or that have been used in traditional architecture. Fourth, we will conclude it with relevance of traditional architecture in the present context with respect to education and practice, followed by issues, concerns, or questions coming up from the participants. I would now like to introduce the speaker for today's session, architect BT Srinivas. We all call him as BT Sir, who is an alumnus of JNAFAU. His keen interest in history of architecture made him join the master's program in conservation at SPA New Delhi. During his career span of 27 years, BT Sir had started his career as a heritage architect to restore the complex of palace buildings in Kuwait after the Gulf War. He then continued to initiate built heritage department to list, document, restore, and reuse historic buildings of Kuwait under the National Council, which is something similar to the National Trust or the Intact in India. He was among the first faculty group to set up the architecture department in Kuwait University. He has also worked in Melbourne with Peter Lowell, who is a top consultant for heritage works in Melbourne. His current discussion is from the work that he has done while at Kuwait University in developing the course and his papers regarding restoration work. Currently, he is a senior design manager with Turner International for the new Kuwait University campus of comprising of 500 acres that is going to house a student strength of around approximately 50,000. He has written many articles on restoration and has been a guest faculty of architecture at various colleges in India, Melbourne, and Kuwait. While the vernacular buildings show a simplistic construction system with minimal expressions of the society, the traditional buildings show a developed style of construction and expression. Both the building typologies represent the prevailing social and cultural systems. Vernacular architecture is the result of constraints on resource availability, which was built on inherently sustainable principles such as resource limitations imposed by economic or natural factors, yet it succeeded in offering rational solutions to harsh climates, human need, and ways of living of the cultures that produce them. In an attempt to understand traditional architecture, we need to understand its evolution, the chronology of development. Traditional architecture aspects, whether they are tangible or intangible, are embedded in the evolution of a settlement. For example, if you take the case of Mysuru, it has an amalgamation of different styles of architecture in its buildings. The traditional Hindu architecture get embellished with Islamic architecture and later with European architecture. And we have seen later on towards the end of 20th century, the emergence of modern architecture. The temples at Srirangapatnam are a typical example of Dravidian architecture, and mosques exemplify the Islamic architecture. The Mysore Palace is a very good example of Indo-Sassanic architecture. Now I request BT Srinivas, sir, to discuss on the chronology of evolution of traditional architecture with respect to the Kuwait example. Over to BT, sir.
Thank you, Kamini. Thank you very much for that great introduction. I really would like to thank you and other alumni who have created this platform as a dialogue between the alumni. And you have given a very big explanation of what my experience is, but I'm very humbly, I want to share what I've done in Kuwait and explore the dialogue between you and other professionals on the panel in terms of what we are at this juncture in terms of what we are looking at as an architects and practice. Because with the situation worldwide with COVID and other pandemic that's been happening, everybody is introspecting whether are we engaging our resources effectively or not. So this probably would generate a discussion on the topic in terms of what the materials that we are using in terms of architecture, what we are creating. Are we wasting resources? Are we actually affecting our resources? With that, I would go through the topic of today's topic of the traditional architecture in Kuwait and come out with some conclusions and discussion at the end. So I'll start sharing my screen now. Okay, if everybody can see the screen. Kuwait, I just want to locate everybody in terms of where Kuwait is. It's not very far from India. It's about 4-hour flight, just after Dubai. It's from Dubai, we are about an hour in flight. It's right in the middle of a Gulf where, the waterlogged area, and Kuwait forms a very big seafront in terms of what created that development. The chronology and history of Kuwait is very vast. It goes back to almost 8,000 BC, but there are ornaments and artifacts found that dates back 4,000 BC, and there's evidences in certain islands that Greeks have relations. They were going by Kuwait when they're traveling through Gulf. However, the actual built heritage that is there in Kuwait dates back about 1700s. As you can see, there is a wide area along the coast which covers the area of country of Kuwait. And most of the settlements, just like any other actual vernacular natural settlements, happen along the water area or where you have natural resources, where you have generally food that is available. So Kuwait is now different to other settlements that happened in terms of traditionally wherever there are hills, there are natural areas. Kuwait is a wide, vast desert apart from the waterfront area. So in terms of the opportunity for food, it's only the fishing that's originally set there. So the basic settlements have come about along the seafront, and then also they were mostly nomadic, which are going around, staying few days and then moving along to pastures. So the original settlements actually started as nomadic settlements, then come about actually creating their own small huts and village along the seafront. The original, in terms of its documentation, Kuwait was originally known as Kut. Kut means a small village in the slang Arabic. So it started as Kut, then became Kuwait in the later age. The earliest documentation that shows us here is the settlements that are along the seafront, huts, mud houses, again fishing boats, sort of a port area. And there were always these tribal battles that are happening between who will control the area, who will control the community, and then become leaders. So there was always this security that's been naturally a problem in Kuwait. So the rulers kept on building walls as the city increased. As you can see here, the 3 walls were built at 3 different times, and the city grew gradually from 1700s to 1900s. So by mid of 1900s, we have 3rd wall that was built. All the walls were with gates, obviously, and then they were all secure. They have guard houses and gate quarters. Similar to this, and the Kuwait, just like any other walled city, has the gate becomes a big sort of juncture where the city is concentrated or focused in terms of their marketplace or trading, and then the entry point obviously is secured to go into the city or come out of the city to go to travel other places. So who is coming in and out is being controlled. Most of the city gates have vanished. Some of the gates still are known by the names, and this is one of the restored gate that still exists along these routes. The roads currently have actually replaced those original walls. So the 3 ring walls that you see in here are currently being replaced by the highways. And the first ring road, the red one, is being replaced by a green belt. So the transformation from here to the current area, of course, is gone drastically between 1950s when oil became evidently discovered, and then the whole overnight transformation of Kuwait into a modern Kuwait has quickly progressed. In terms of actual resource, that what is concentrated in terms of settlement is fishing as a main activity. So people fish, go in the boats, fish and bring fish, and then that becomes their daily activity. Other than that, Kuwaiti fishermen also very famous for diving for pearls. So pearl selling and trading is another major activity that's went along with Kuwait to Oman to India. So pearl diving and fishing are the major activities that are concentrated, other than the herding of sheep and camels. Kuwaiti boats are very popular along the Gulf area. These are called dhows, and the bigger ships are called booms. They are very intricately constructed, even the small to big. So that kind of woodwork is originating from India, from Kerala particularly to Kuwait. And still some of these rich Kuwaitis keep the modern boats in the same shape for their fishing time. As you can see on the screen, the settlement that's pretty much very closely knit is concentrated on the seafront with few port areas that are carved out. Most of the streets, as you can see, are leading to either shoreline or towards the city center. City center means the marketplace. So effectively the entire city, as if it is stitched together with streets that are very, very narrow and meandering. And most of the time they are sloping towards the seashore, because even though Kuwait is a very hot and dry climate, there are yearly once or twice you would get rains, very heavily torrential rains that would flood areas. So the entire city is built upon with a higher ground, and the runoff is towards the city, towards the seashore. Of course, the seafront is the most attractive place, and the hierarchy of development also followed that. So whoever is richer and higher in power usually stayed onto the seafront, and those who are middle range or poorer are effectively far from the seashore. So again, the concentration of the power, concentration of the richness, and larger houses are always on the seafront. In terms of the size of the families and the size of the houses, of course, it basically depends on the person who is traders who are rich effectively in those areas. They could build large compounds for themselves. And the workers and then supporting staff obviously have smaller places and smaller houses. However, the entire area, entire city, as if it is speaks one language. You have smaller to bigger courtyards or smaller to bigger houses that are knit together, forming streets. Streets, as if the streets become very active outdoor spaces when somebody gets out of their house, because houses themselves are becoming like a fortress by themselves because of mainly because of the climate and the dust storms that come in Kuwait. So you have very high walls, and you're usually entering into your house by one or two doors. Except those two entryways, everything else is completely shielded from the climate. So not only these create a very straightforward kind of vista kind of streets, effectively going to either seashore or to the marketplace, but also they become wash away areas. So whenever there is a rain, the rain is all collected and then sloped down to the seashore. People could actually come out and stay inside between the streets because they're mostly shaded all the time. The temperatures, as you know, they could vary between 20 degrees during the normal winter times to 50 plus degrees during the summer times. So the street becomes completely shaded because of the high walls and the narrowness of the street in here. The outside areas obviously become pleasant. After the work, people gather around. This is a bench that usually is seen in most of the villages, even some of the villages in Andhra Pradesh, as far as I know. It's called dacha here. It's along the street front. People sit, chat, and effectively even talk about their work, trade. And along the streets, all these become like as gathering places and places of collaboration and communication for them. The doorway that you see is the main doorway that enters into a house in here. The other major activities that are generally happening in that time is, of course, one is the fishing and the boats along the seafront. Then the marketplaces, you have smaller storage areas, trading places, which is on the right, top right, and then the mosques that are again closely followed within the neighborhoods with the same language. You have a door to the mosque, and you just have you can identify a mosque by the minaret, which is higher on top, and there are other marketplaces where you have usually shaded by the palm leaf matting on the top. So the street of the market even follows the similar concept of the market being closely knit. People open the shops completely outdoors and then shaded during the summers with, every summer they replace the palm shading of the top. That's more effectively the way that Kuwait lived in till 1950s, till oil came into the effective economy. They depended on the fishing, so markets are concentrated on that. The trading of cattle or trading of pearls. So everything is concentrated towards the seashore. Everything, the power in terms of palaces or divaniyas where people meet in the evenings are focused onto the seashore, and rest of the family houses or smaller houses are to the backward. So with that, I will ask Kaminiji to react on what's been presented. Thank you.
Yeah. We'll go to the next next part of the session, sorry. I'm reminded of what Frank Lloyd Wright had said. The mother art is architecture. Without an architecture of our own, we have no soul of our own civilization. Just last year, we from the college had visited settlements in Telangana to understand its morphology. We had studied settlements of Marikal, Dichpalli, Cheriyal, Tandur, Gadwal, Sirsila, Varadal, and Narayanpuram. And what we have observed is that the settlements' form and structure were result of centuries of evolutionary process and knowledge transfer influenced by climate, geology, religion, socio-cultural values, economics, and administrative forces. Many housing typologies were identified which were varying in size, shape, detailing, but not in their climate sensitivity. These spaces synchronized with their activities, whether it was the front open spaces in Cheryal, which was used for doing the paintings. Cheryal is known for its scroll paintings, or the courtyards in Silla, which was used by handloom weavers, though now it is replaced by the power looms. Houses in Gadwal, known for textile weaving, have had a separate living area, a wet area, a workspace, storage, and drying space. Courtyards were something very typical of most of the housing typologies, which was, of course, used for different purpose at different places. I'm reminded of Vastu Shastra, which is a combination of rules and rituals applied by the master builders on the local craftsmen. The concept was to guide people to create spaces which harmonize with nature and with the universal forces. But the principles of Vastu Shastra science of architecture, which regards the environmental features of sun rays, magnetic poles, the geopathic zones, etc. But somehow, due to the lack of enough of knowledge, there has been it has been considered as symbolic or ritualistic by the later generations. It was only when the IEA in 2017 came up with a report and stated that buildings were responsible for 36% of the global energy consumption and which emitted nearly 40% of the global carbon dioxide emission. Today we talk of sustainable architecture, which needs technology and tradition. The impact of the built environment on climatic change has forced us to introduce technological fixes through insulation, high efficiency heating and cooling, greening energy production, the alternative sources of energy, the wind energy and the solar energy, which we talk of today, and adding high-tech solutions to further reduce the energy demand. We talk of smart thermostat, zero carbon house, net zero, etc. And the concept of hedonistic sustainability, where you re-embrace elements from traditional vernacular architecture with new technology and which does not compromise in terms of the cost or the functionality. BT sir, can you just throw light on these elements and factors which have shaped up the traditional architecture and its application in today's context? You can take the example of the Kuwait architecture which you have studied. So how these factors which have shaped up the traditional architecture, and in today's context, how do you see how much of it is relevant? Because today, again, we are going back to the sustainable practices and where we talk of alternative energy sources. So where do you see the connect between the two?
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, the elaborate studies that you have mentioned really vary between different places in terms of Telangana, or if you go to Rajasthan, the similar way, the way that traditional architecture came about in Rajasthan towns is quite different to what you have just described.
Yeah, is there any similarity in the northwestern India and especially with respect to the desert climate similarity? Is there any resemblance?
Absolutely no resemblance, except probably the built fabric or form, because the traditional architecture basically is dependent on what you have on hand and what's next to you. And as you know, vernacular architecture by itself means being local. What's yours is being built. So in Rajasthan, if you see, while this is a desert climate, but they have a very natural resource, very much close by natural resource of stone available. And people could pick stones and build their village houses with stones. And they can make lime with the limestone, for example. Or if they have nearby quarry, they can cut stone and bring it and build their houses. But whereas in Kuwait or most of the desert areas in Africa, you have no natural resource. You have the only resource that is available next to the sea is sand. And you really have to find places where you actually can get something to mix with sand and actually form clay material. So that's been a problem in most of these Middle East countries, except Saudi Arabia, where you have different and Oman, we have different climatic areas and different geography and stone available in the hills. In Kuwait, it's a flat land. You don't have any other resource except some clay quarries that are found in desert areas. So you have to dig deep to get clay soil. And the only other material they could find is the coral stone. Coral stone comes from, deep diving into the sea, and you have the coral, and you bring out and break the coral stone into and stitch it together with what you have, a clay, clay material and mixed with sand. And probably again, they needed some other materials which obviously they haven't got. So they depended for those materials the closest countries, which is Iraq and Iran. So what influenced the whole architecture is quite different to, even though the climate that is probably very hot and humid, like Rajasthan, is quite different to what we have here because of the natural materials. The availability of material is quite different to what you have in Rajasthan or here.
Okay, right.
Yeah. So let's see in terms of architecture, what's common and what's not. As I said in the first part, I purposefully not really touched upon the cultural aspects or religious aspects or the way people live. And I will just looked at it as a physical aspect, how the form shaped in terms of reaction to the climate, in response to the climate. In the previous slides, I've shown that the bigger buildings or palaces or the rich people lived next to the seafront, while the middle range or the staff, etc., lived at the back. So what we have is the typical typology is a courtyard. Whether it's a palace or it's a smaller house or a bigger house or it's a trading place, everything is basically dependent on inward activity. So people have to bring shade to inside, which become most active space in a house or in a shop or even in a palace. So obvious choice was to bring something around and create a place in the middle which is shaded by the walls themselves or by the structure by itself. So self shading is the most common aspect that you would see, as I said, in the streets. Also, it's most common aspect in the courtyard. While the bigger houses have several courtyards, and like what you see on the screen is, you have a separate kitchen area where it's family and the ladies are concentrated, and the family courtyard where people together, family meets in here, and the Divania courtyard where it is for the public, people from outside could gather. So the place is divided into different courtyard spaces, again connected together with smaller bits of rooms next to each other. And obviously, the water has been a very much an essential item in here. They don't really have drinking water, so they're dependent on bringing the water from other places. Even the central area of the kitchen obviously will require some washing, etc. So there is usually a well, which is called jaleb, in the middle, and there is a storage space. And also, what you see here is two major entry points into a bigger house. So you have a family courtyard where the family enters, and the guests usually enter from the Divania courtyard. And they basically convene in here, and then that's their point. And this is actually a fort in Kuwait. It's called the Zahra Fort, Red Fort, for example. So you can see how different, even though the fort as a word is applied in here. It's a huge complex of rooms that are kept around a larger wall. But all the rooms are similar size. As you can see, the openings are similar, the walls are similar, because again, we'll discuss about the materiality and what is available in here. Smaller openings is a major feature in here, because you want to protect sun rays not to come into the rooms, and you want to actually create the vent effect that brings in the cool air. The terrace is another bigger area that people actually gather around and sometimes sleep during the summers, I mean. In terms of plan, The walls are very thickly built, with about 10 to 12 feet across. And you have 1 or 2 rooms that are second floor, I mean, reaching up to the second level, either with a straight staircase or a roof sleeping space on the top. In more, rich people's houses, you have arcades, sometimes decorated, and usually opening into the courtyards. These are called, these corridors with arcades are called livan, which is a very common feature. So particularly towards, Kuwait sun arrangement, the orientation of the streets is towards north-south, and then you have mostly shaded areas. And the sun is actually on the top during the midday and the north is usually protected. So you have northern parts usually are completely shaded, and western and eastern parts usually have a horizontal sun. So looking at that aspect as well, usually the courtyard is completely half shaded, at least in the entire day. The higher walls, again, are a major feature because of the storms that hit with sand. So whenever there are dust storms in the summer, a large amount of sand actually comes in and hits onto the walls and windows. So the windows have to be protected, the openings have to be protected. And so the walls, once you enter into a house, usually have complete closure. And the rooftop rooms usually bring in cool air because of these features that actually bring the air into the building, which we'll see later. Some of the examples of bigger courtyard houses, very similar features, sometimes with arches opening as a major entry point, with separate courtyards for again, the size of the courtyards is dependent on how big the house wants to be, because it's building the entire plot with basically going around fortifying the area and then looking inwards how we want to construct your inner spaces. Another example of large courtyard house. These are sometimes, joint families living together, lots of people in one house. And this is a photograph that shows the well.
You're sharing the slides? You're sharing slides?
Yes. Are you not seeing the slides?
No, we are not able to see the slides.
We are able to see the slides. We need to just tap on the presentation.
Yes. Yeah, you can see. Go ahead. Please go ahead. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, this particular slide shows you the well, which is behind the wall, and as you can see that the people take water out. This is salt water, but still for regular domestic use. And it's usually in the middle of the kitchen courtyard. And bicha is basically a big tank. So the water that is filled up into the tank and used around. For praying, they would go into ablution in here, and then they can pray along in the courtyard. Wood has been, has to be imported, basically brought in from Iraq or India. So people who are rich, they could afford to have wooden columns, and then a very simple carved capitals with octagonal columns that are imported in to support the livan or the arcade, which opens into the courtyard. And the stairs that lead up to the roof are very small, narrow, and then basically closed off during the dust storms, but generally to provide a sleeping place on the top roof terrace. A series of slides that show another big courtyard house. Currently, these houses are all protected and preserved, mostly as museums or to explain the history, walk around history of Kuwait. They are originally belonging to important tradesmen, and now they have been acquired by the government, which converted them into showpieces of the history. As you can see here, the floor itself is brickwork. The bricks are made, again, from the clay, very thick, about 30 by 30 centimeters with 10 centimeter high. these bricks are paved over, and that becomes, again, in the smaller houses, you don't really find bricks because bricks are expensive in those days, and then they're just plastered with mud. A simple diagram that shows, courtyard proportions of Kuwaiti house at any given time. This is peak summer in July, you would still see half of the court covered in shade, and the next house will start after similar size of the street. So the streets are usually shaded, that you can see on the left side. And when you add a smaller structure on the top, you actually provide a better shading onto the roof. So the roof becomes cooler at that point. So that space becomes usable in the evenings. So the proportions of the courtyard and the shading that's employed and the orientation of the buildings were very much an in thing, because the set streets that go from north-south axis are usually already been taken care of. So you have to follow that grid. You have to follow those street lines, and people have been left out spaces to build on. So that's really set forth in terms of what they do, in terms of how they oriented the houses and the courtyards. Here, a little bit about the construction. We talked about what is available material in Kuwait. These walls are, one of the broken down houses in the city shows the stone walls that is almost like 1 meter thick stone walls. So obviously you have a lot of thermal capacity within the stone wall. So the temperatures outside, even if they are about more than 50 degrees, the inside temperatures are almost 40 degrees down. So you 60 to 20 degrees of interior spaces that you can really feel. And then it's about 12-hour cycle. So by the time the outside heats up, the inside, it cools down by this temperature difference. And some of the rich houses also have projected balconies, again, built in wood. These are called mushrabiyas, which are basically to look at what's going on into the courtyard or what's happening to the next door, not being visible. These are jarakas for example, in Rajasthan, we can find these as jarakas. Even in Telangana, in the old city, we would see some of these structures which are projecting out, and you can look down upon the street. So, however, these are very, very few in Kuwait, because this is very expensive to actually bring those craftsmen and do this kind of work. So they're limited to 1 or 2 rich houses. Along these jarakas, you would keep usually the water pots inside. So these jarakas are open, so you would have fenestration through the wood. So water pots cool off the air and brings in. So the air vents, how you vent inside, where you have just opening of a door into a room, is a very ingeniously thought of technique. It's a thick 1 centimeter thick, 1 meter thick wall. You would create a small intermediate wall to actually push air by creating a differential pressure between 2 zones. So air from a pressurized area or hot air would usually travel to the cool air. So it's equilibrium that is creating this air movement. And this is also seen using openings on the rooftop through the parapets, or through creating a complete wall that brings down the air down into the rooms along the courtyard. So what you see here is openings that are on the roof parapet. So you have an opening here where below here you have openings. So the air actually strikes the wall and goes down and then gets into the cooler, because it's traveling the entire length of the wall, and then you are getting the air at the bottom from into the room. And in the inside of these houses, you would have put these water pots, so that the air, when it travels down, actually touches upon the pots and then gets you into a comfortable condition. And some of these have developed them into different sizes and openings. Some of them, again, with a wooden cover. So during the dust storms, they would simply cover them so the dust wouldn't enter it. Or during the cleaning process, they would take out those and clean inside. Some of these indigenous systems that air movement into the buildings is creating wonderful passive ventilation. That's you would hit, for example, a parapet here and bring down the air through the opening into the air, which is the section that is shown here. Or these are called the bath gears. A tower is created upwards about another level up into the onto the roof, where you can bring in air from any direction and then gets down. Something like this, which is now demolished, this particular structure. So you would hit the wind with this and then brings down through here into the room. The interiors are very simple, generally lime plastered and niches that would give storage spaces for kitchen or the living area. So all these features are basically responding to what's available, at the same time very ingeniously creating the atmosphere to bring the air into hot air inside, but getting it cooler by transporting through the very thick walls. So as you started, so that's very, very different to the ideas that are generated in Rajasthan, for example, with a similar climatic conditions. I mean, from here, I would explain you why it's so different in terms of its materials. So if you have any questions, I would pause.
Have you seen any during this transformation from traditional architecture to the modern? Have you seen any change or effect on the planning and in terms of the materials?
In terms of the new architecture?
Yeah, this transformation
yes,
that you have seen.
Has
it affected the planning and in terms of the materials?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in terms of, currently what's happening in Kuwait is since the drastic economical uplift with the oil, you can actually buy things from outside and you don't need to depend on what's available anymore in Kuwait. So you have the availability of resource. That's not a criteria anymore, not a constraint anymore. So once you have that, the whole situation of planning your house has changed, except how you live in terms of privacy for the women, privacy for the family, and the semi-private zone for the Diwania. That's all the same, except that the materials are different. The way that the planning has, the Diwanis have become bigger. The rooms obviously have become bigger because previously the rooms have to be smaller to span across not more than 12 feet, because that's what you have available in terms of beam spanning. Those are, we will see in the next few slides that what sort of beams are there, because they were limited in terms of the span. So obviously, even if you look at the old Hyderabadi houses, you cannot probably span more than 14 feet, because that's the timber that's available, that's optimally sized. And you create your roof structure and the room sizes according to what you can span.
You have just mentioned about the passive cooling techniques, which were very strong as far as vernacular architecture is concerned. Do you feel that the modern HVAC systems have degraded its value and leading to loss of this ancient technique?
Absolutely. I think we are, as you mentioned in the beginning, we are turning into a full circle where we have left out all our passive cooling systems when we didn't have air conditioning, even in India. And coming back to see that we are not wasting our energy and resource, because now we are building houses and they have become hot houses because we are planning them as hot houses so that we can cool them. So that we have glazing that we want to see out. We want to create glazing and the facades that are brilliantly expressive with glazing, and we are not really worried about whether the house is becoming cool or hot, because you have your hierarchy of expression of a house has changed. Originally, a house is a need, and you want to live comfortably without any air conditioning. I mean, there was no air conditioning, and with what you have. But now you have everything, so you would like to express the house as your personal choice and a status symbol. So that has really put us into a place where now we are turning back and saying, I have a hot house, but I would like to cool it better.
What happens during the dust storms? Do the wind vents have a closing arrangement?
Yeah, as I shown you one of the slides, yes, they usually cover them with wooden planks. Otherwise, yeah, just, usually the dust storm, you can see it from a distance. About a kilometer away, you can see that the dust storm is coming. So they would prepare themselves in time, and they go close off all the windows, close off all the doors. People come in, they don't go into the sea, of course, and people who are in the streets and markets, they will just come inside the houses and then close everything off, and the vents as well.
What about the drainage system, the traditional drainage system versus the modern system? Do you find something good or something bad in either of them, or a comparison of the two?
See, in terms of stormwater drainage, Kuwait is a very hot and humid, hot climate, not humid. The only time it rains is once or twice in a year. That brings in clouds from other countries and from north. So there is no rainy season in Kuwait. You have a long hot season, about 7 months, and you have a cooler month, about 3-4 months. So, but intermittent, it might rain once or twice in Kuwait, and then it pours down. When it rains, it really pours for 3-4 hours. So the entire thing gets flooded. So what they have done is the entire city is usually higher up from the ground, from the sea level. So the water just flows down into the sea. That was in the olden days. Now, of course, you have a modern drainage system that is interconnected. And by the way, we still have problems with drainage because of sand. Whenever there is a sandstorm, you wouldn't believe about 15 to 30 centimeter layers of sand is dropped onto the roads. So the drainage really clogs down with the sand, and the maintenance of the central works really have to go back and remove whenever there is sand, remove these places. And underpasses and bridges still have a problem because whenever there is an sudden rain that comes in and it really floods them. So they want the drivers not to go underground, under the passes.
The jharokas which we see in, there is a similarity in the Rajasthani vernacular architecture as far as that is concerned. Is there any exchange or takeaway of concept between the two countries? And even with respect to the ornamentation that you were just talking about, do you see any influence of the other Asian countries over Kuwait architecture?
Yeah, I think there is a very similar approach in terms of privacy. If you look at Rajasthan, in the olden days, the women folk are still very private. They wouldn't be coming out into the street. They are completely with a gungat. And then when they have to actually see what's going on onto the street level or a public space, jharokas are the only ones they could come in and lean over to look at on the street. And it's a very similar concept here. So the women folk inside can come onto the balcony without actually being seen. So they are closed off from the street, but they actually can see through these fenestrations down what's happening. So that's really the similar concept.
Okay. Now, when we talk of traditional architecture, the talk goes incomplete without remembering what Hassan Fateh has said. He said, build your architecture from what is beneath your feet. And he was known for incorporating traditional design and building materials. He wrote, here, for years and for centuries, the peasant has been wisely and quietly exploiting the obvious building material, while we, with our modern school-learned ideas, never dreamt of using such a ludicrous substance as mud for so serious a creation as a house. He trained the local inhabitants to make their own materials and build their own buildings. Fateh cared more about improving the standard of living for the people he served than to do with fancy materials and technology. I'm reminded of his works when we talk of traditional architecture. Could you discuss these aspects of the techniques that has been used with respect to the local, available materials in case of Kuwait?
Yeah, Hassan Fateh is a great exponent of again mud architecture. There are many other institutions actually, even in India, Development Alternatives, for example, there is a group which cleanly follows the mud architecture stream, and However, there are limitations to what you can do with mud. You can build, of course, in Yemen, you can see that there are buildings up to 6-7 floors created in mud, still standing. Mud is an eternal material, and if you are maintaining it properly, of course, you can create mud houses forever. However, it's a maintainability aspect that comes into when you build with mud. Are you able to go back and plaster the mud every time it erodes? It's a very similar thing that's happening in Kuwait as well. You asked about the rains. Whenever there is a rain, along the street fronts, the bottom part of the walls gets eroded. So people have to go back and plaster it again with either lime or mud, whatever they have. So the continuous maintenance aspect has to be we have to accept that fact that it has to be maintained properly. And if you look at kind of construction techniques and the materials in Kuwait, you have, as I said, mud is one of the important materials that binds together with the stone that is coming out from the seafront. So as you can see, this is the eroded part of the wall where with the rains people haven't maintained it. So you can actually see the coral walls that are constructed in layers. There is no regularity. It's just putting stones upon stones with lumps of mud. It's a basic technique of constructing something vertical. However, because of the technology that involves in shaping and making the brick or etc., they don't have it at that time, and they would really depend on what's available again in terms of clay and coral stone. So they created massive walls, which can be taken to the structure can stand with the massive walls, and only the rich could afford to bring in bricks from Iraq or Iran. So they have craftsmen coming into Kuwait from Iraq with actually shaped bricks which are built. So some of the houses that you would see are with brick building. So
there are okay, yeah.
Yeah, in terms of I'm just showing this slide as a cross section of the entire coral wall. How it's almost about 90 centimeter, 1 meter thick, and tapers up and basically carries the loads of the roof across. Both sides of you have a lower street level and a higher inside level. So that basically creates your waterproofing. Other than that, the basic waterproofing that they use is ash in those days. Whatever is burnt, coal or reed, all this burnt material is used as a waterproofing material, both under the basement, under the foundations, as well as under the floors, also on the roofs. So they don't have real waterproofing except the burnt ash and coal. So in here also it shows that everything is in equilibrium because the building is a breathable object. So here all the elements that are put together are breathing. There is no concrete, there's no real plaster in terms of stopping the air to go out of or the humidity to go out of these walls. Everything is in equilibrium. It gets wet and it gets dried. So you have to accept the fact that the walls are wet when it is raining, and they will be dried when it's sunny. So even the floors, they get wet and they will be dried. So there's always this air movement, the breathingness that happens within the building. And in terms of the roofing, that's one thing that is amazing in Kuwait is the roof here is built of mud. Even though it's not directly with mud, it's about 30 centimeters of mud kept on bamboos and reeds and mangrove beams in here. The section in here, if you can see, this is chandal beam, which is basically a big mangrove beam. And over that, you have strips of palm tied together and a matting on the top, and then a lumps of mud slab that was put it on top of it with a plaster of probably if they can get lime. And water is sloped down to go into the street. So these are the layers of the roof making. So you have chandal beams. We call chandal is basically mangroves which are about 12 feet that you can get, and spliced bamboo that's diagonally spaced, what you can see below between them. And the beams are kept about 30 centimeter spacing, and on the top you have a palm matting. The palm leaves are woven together to form a mat and then kept. And over that, a layer of ramad. Ramad is ash. As I said, it's used for waterproofing. On the top, a thick layer of mud and a plaster. So that's really a roof. So you also have, in terms of climate response, a very thick roof to protect you from heat gain. So the roof is plastered white as well. They're plastering with lime, or they have mud, and then they will plaster that with lime. So it's reflecting the heat, but it is also not transferring, because you have really a thick mud slab that doesn't allow the heat to come into the house. Some examples of the ceilings that are so inside you would see this sort of a ceiling, and externally outside on the roof you would just see a mud slab. These are recently been refurbished as traditional divanias. If they can get tar or bitumen, these are painted with tar or bitumen. But however, to get this, again, it's a material that's imported in that way. So they paint it, and they come in with black tar, and the beams are put across, and after that the construction happens. Some other examples of a very similar thing. I mean, it's very common to systematically make these things as readily available. So you have mats being made, you have those beams being made with the correct sizes and spacing, and on the top the spliced bamboo and then the mud. So you have some of them prefabricated, if you can say, and others are on the site. As I mentioned, the brickwork is really an expensive preposition, so they have to be imported, and they come from Iraq. They used to come from Iraq, or then sometimes from Iran, and they're cut with geometric shapes. Again, Islamic patterns in here, and this is one of the palaces that has been restored with this brickwork. Doors are really, the status of the person can be seen by the height and the width of the door by itself. So the bigger the door, obviously the person's house is bigger and the richer. As you can see, the smaller door are usually the normal use for the families to come in and out. This is because of the dust storms again. So the dust is kept out, and then only the smaller door is opened in regular terms. Here also you can see the seats along the, once you enter into the building, this is a small guest area where people sit along this bench. Different types of doors. Again, you can very much validate this with the craftsmanship of the boat making. The nails are from the boats. The way that they lacquer the wood is from the boats. So the craftsmanship of the boats is transformed into creating the doors. So probably this is the only rich element that you find in the whole house. So the door is an expression of how rich the person is. And other parts of the wood that is being used is the drain pipes, and then columns sometimes. And the courtyard is either paved with mud, or if they can afford, they can pave them with thick brickwork. So these materials are actually the constraints for them to build. So you have a limitation in terms of a span. Mangroves are imported from India, from Mumbai in those days. So they have to bring those beams, and then they could make the palm leaves here with the palm matting and the spliced beams. But rest of the things are basically clay and coral stone. That's what is left out to construct. So that's why you ended up having smaller span rooms and linear stretch of rooms together around a courtyard, which obviously do not transfer heat from either from the exterior or from the roof. So courtyard is really a central phenomenon. Somebody said that there is nowhere that you cannot find a courtyard house in the vernacular architecture. So courtyard phenomena is a simplistic form of where people can arrange their rooms around to protect from elements. So as vernacular architecture is evolved from, in response to the climate, that's the best way probably to protect oneself from just creating a space with walls and work inwards. Whereas you asked about what is the transformation into the modernity. Now I believe the courtyard is outward. So you don't really create a courtyard for purpose that's originally thought, but actually you look out for everything. You depend on how you want to view out rather than view inwards.
Architectural identity acts as the link between design and social life, and it has to coexist with spiritual architecture that speaks for humanity and culture. Is this practice still followed in any of the recent examples?
Well, I think it's only followed in the theory, but in my opinion, when it is applied to the practice, they become mere theoretical concepts. And when it actually applied into building projects, very few architects have been successful in what they wanted to create in terms of passive responsive climatic design. I was wondering about actually, the curriculum has changed, I believe, in terms of teaching. But when we studied climatology is the major subject in terms of what you design. So we didn't really have the the BREEAM and the LEED or the actually certifying what you did. But you naturally develop that inherently to design buildings in response to what you have around. You oriented your buildings properly to sun path. You created openings that are to be naturally oriented. You brought light where you need, and you protected the sun where you don't need. So those are the basic aspects I think are to be dwelled upon to look at in terms of when you actually transform the ideas of traditional architecture to modernity.
There are quite some questions in the chat box.
Okay.
The wells contain salt water. So where do they get the fresh water and how do they store them?
Okay, they have to import the drinking water from close by from Iraq or from sometimes even I was told the ice used to come from Mumbai.
All right. When did the industrialized or modern development start in Kuwait? How far is the vernacular style of construction being carried out contemporarily in the country?
In 1950s, once the oil explored, the immediate thing they also imported was concrete. Concrete block was the immediate available material that is imported into Kuwait. So most of the developments starting from 1950s to 60s, 70s, actually completely eroded these mud houses and replaced by the concrete block houses. So in the beginning, what they did is they replaced the wall of mud with wall of block work. So in the beginning years of transformation, the form remained the same. You have still a courtyard form, but the actual materials were concrete blocks and reinforced concrete beams. So that was then actually transformed into started bigger areas. So you completely done away with the courtyard format, and what you start seeing in 80s and 90s and now is you don't anymore have courtyards. You have atrium spaces which are high-rise and then covered with glazing. So it's become a glass house inside, so to create some landscape and nice features.
In general, we have seen that art forms are influential. Now, with respect to what you have shown, where are the carvings of buildings and doors influenced from?
Definitely from India. As I said, the boat craftsmanship is imported from Indian boat making. So it's a very simple craftsmanship. You carve out the edges of the doors or the central part of the door. Other than that, you really don't see any decorative elements. Sometimes you see the carved niches in mud plaster or lime plaster. You just apply a regular arch, a smaller arch cornice. Otherwise, usually you don't see any decorative elements in Kuwaiti houses.
With respect to the roof, mud, etc., does it had to be redone every time frequently, or how long does it last?
I mean, the mud houses lasted for hundreds of years. In fact, the palace building that I worked on was about 120 years old when we started restoring it. So as you mentioned, Hassan Fatih's or the architecture of mud still remains as long as you maintain it. So there is no, the mud doesn't go away. It stays as long as you maintain it. So if the mud goes away in one rain, you go back and plaster it. So that's how it stayed for years. As I said, mud is eternal, mud is ageless. So as long as you can maintain it, it's a material that carries on.
Yeah. While in today's context, when we speak in today's context, wherein a lot of research has been done as to the combination of traditional architecture with the high-tech, techniques that we adopt today. For example, the combination of traditional and high-tech would provide best results. For example, you can use the digital modeling techniques which can factor in sunlight, prevailing winds, airflow turbulence, and help optimize the design. The 3D printing provides for freedom to build any design while minimizing on the materials, etc. High-tech can actually felicitate and optimize the old wisdom of traditional architecture. So is it time that we re-embrace these elements of traditional and vernacular architecture into the local conditions and local needs while making use of the modern technology? Do you think that it is also time to rethink the re-vernacular? Researchers called it as thinking re-vernacular, and vernacular rethinking is used to express the idea of thinking, about applying previously held vernacular building values into the present context. So how do you think, this will also need to shape up or change the building bylaws, where you need to allow for more out of place designs in this? How do you look at it in the present context as to how this kind of a change is going to be incorporated with the contemporary design?
Yeah, that's.
And what are the solutions for it? How do you perceive how do you look at the future?
Yeah, I think there is no one answer for this question, because I don't really like branding buildings. Like we don't want to brand vernacular architecture and let's carry vernacular architecture to the future or present generation. I think that idea really segregates the mainstream. Unless you bring, we started off doing this as a sustainable architecture. We are talking about, circular economy, and we are talking about sustainable means of resources, materiality that's locally available rather than, expending resources. So we have to go into that context and look at architecture. If you brand an architecture and let's continue what's there in the vernacular style or vernacular theme and generate for the future, it sort of becomes more problematic, in my opinion, because from the beginning, whenever somebody did a vernacular style building, it's branded as something that's not really up to the mark. Whenever somebody did a glass facade or a minimalist architecture, something out of the place, and immediately it caught upon the critics' eye, as well as architects go wow about it. Whereas a building that's simply done with traditional techniques and kept aside, so it's mundane, it's not been talked about, so it's not mainstream. So I think we have to bridge this gap in terms of where the common architecture is going. As you know, in a general tendency for anybody who wants to build a house is to build as good as possible and then express what his desires are. We used to know that even though the houses are built of concrete and stainless steel reinforced concrete, you have slope roofs in Banjara Hills once upon a time, because slope roof actually denoted a person is being rich. That's how it's characterized. But the slope roof is not made of mangalore tiles or pot tiles or wooden beams or rafter. It's made of concrete. So there is this notion of certain representative features being rich and being stylistic and exploring modernity. Rather than looking at it, actually truthfulness to the materials. You want to use a material that is true to nature. You use it as it is required to be used in terms of technique and craftsmanship.
Exactly, and which is why we say that the traditional architecture does not go through fashion cycles. And as you are saying, it has to stand out and not fit in, because we have seen a lot of disastrous examples where they have tried to fit in the vernacular architecture, and that has become a very bad example. So instead of the fit in module, it has to stand out and it has to serve the context in which it is designed. With respect to this study, how do you look at the change that it has to undergo in terms of to serve the education and in terms of practice? How do you look at serving both the purpose?
I think I mean, we can do a lot in terms of education rather than basically either education or practice. What we are doing is, in my opinion, it's imitating the West rather than looking and introspecting ourselves and looking at what we have and rich architecture that could be generated out of vernacular materials that are resourced from locally, techniques that could be developed and continued locally. We are basically imitating the Western ideology and principles of education. So what we now look at, either NAB certified courses or AIA certified, subjects, we need to bring in more in terms of traditional approach, where we should learn from our side what we have. For example, there should be courses that are introducing, even as an elective, for example, traditional architecture course. As I said, started off this, we have introduced this in Kuwait. We have a subject called local architecture. Students study that for credits, and then during the summers, and they go about actually doing a studio on documenting something that they believe is interesting, and then actually trying to transform that into a design project. So there could be a lot could be done in terms of, you said you already are doing some studies in Telangana. That's a great opportunity for the students to learn from what has been done. These buildings are not done by architects. With that fact, you go about looking about common architecture that's been developed everywhere, but you understand how this has come about. What is the material that they used in the way that they used, why they use it, and how they actually responded to climate or other constraints that they may have. How, for example, Shabad stone is used in some areas in Telangana in terms of roofing or the walls, how it is different. So those are inherent qualities that I think we should be teaching students to actually document and learn from doing work. I'm not sure whether you have these courses now in terms of actually focused onto vernacular or traditional or local architecture. We learned history of architecture. European architecture. We learned about Indian monuments. I mean, I'm not talking about architecture that's dependent, architecture that's coming out of monumentality. We are talking about common architecture.
We do have, it is more of a literature work, when it comes to the vernacular architecture studies in the curriculum here. And there is no hands-on experience, which I think should be propagated, the hands-on experience in vernacular architecture. We do have some kind of workshops held in Auroville, where students do go there and they get a good experience of the traditional style of building, and their workshops are really good. In fact, if you look at our Indian system of architecture, it encompasses the field of planning, architecture, interiors, including iconography and sculpture, as well as vehicle design. It also covers the building material properties, construction techniques, among all the other professions together. In fact, with the NEP 2020, which is focusing on this traditional system, we hope that a lot of these things will, this knowledge base will more widen up, and it will be more accessible to more students, especially in terms of the education. There are also some questions in the chat box, which Rammed earth bricks are back in practice for many reasons, which is depicted from vernacular. Do you foresee more such things returning to architecture in the near future?
The RAM rat or the Adobe architecture is again,
Yeah.
a very focused idea of architecture being propagated as one stream. Uh, I would rather go with actually bringing in the perception of traditional architecture as a common architecture. So if you believe that rammed earth is available next door to you, and people can build with their own hands, and the community could. I mean, this is community development. So you're looking at projects that are community oriented, where people can participate in the construction of their houses. So if that is available, yes, but don't impose and say that you have to do this, because from the beginning, I think perception is the problem. When we created the modern architecture and then modernity as the to-go thing, our buildings of concrete stand more than mud buildings as a perception. We have actually eliminated all the traditional architecture as lower and not higher, because we immediately stamped that as it's poor architecture. It's for the poor. It's for not for the rich. The rich would live in concrete houses which have higher roofs and all that. Whereas you have to cater for the poor, so you build smaller houses with what's available in the traditional way. So I think there is this perception gap, and people have to be acknowledging that from. I mean, you mentioned about the regulatory or authority approaches. Yes, for example, if a government is generating housing, they should be looking at what are the traditional techniques. You could actually bring in a whole cycle of bringing craftsmen, developing their skills to actually bring their own materials from the resources that are available locally, rather than importing
The
or
self-help,
building something.
the self-help method.
Yes.
Okay.
So on the screen, what I was showing you is these education that we could do. I mean, once you learn about deciphering architecture, once you learn about what's happened in the past, whether it's a given building, we generally study, as I said, very big monuments. But if you go and look at traditional architecture and how they came about and how they actually reacted to the climate, you would learn a lot in terms of how to address that issue with what's available in terms of frugal way and what we call now lean construction, end-to-end solutions. It's all a basic learning process from here. So it also creates the engagement of you talk to the craftsmen, you talk to the people who are building it, and then you understand how they are doing it, and actually you do it yourself so that you learn from them, and then you can create these groups of links from where the housing can develop.
Although many influences were from India as far as art form and planning is concerned, but how big is the influence of Islamic architecture in Kuwait vernacular style?
There is nothing as such called Islamic architecture. I mean, if you coin an arch as an Islamic architectural element, yes, there are a number of buildings that would employ that feature as an Islamic architecture. But Islamic architecture has a the very very vast definition in the sense. It is not just motifs and decorative items. It is the inherent quality of how you generate your spaces. I mean, we talked about the privacy and space planning. That's come about from the culture. So I mean, people don't really focus on now if they want to really build modern houses. They are building houses that are minimalist. That's the trend now. So they go by the trend. So in the last 10 years, they have seen the European minimalist buildings, which are blank facades, and everything looking at as interior lit atrium spaces. So that's the trend now in Kuwait. So I don't see a real big push on towards employing elements of Islamic architecture as such.
Okay, the so-called living or breathing walls and roofs that existed in vernacular times is now again getting into the present green buildings. Do you see this fact that we have started realizing that we should not leave behind the strengths of vernacular?
Yes, I think definitely the passive solar or passive energy saving, passive features that we have in our own traditional architecture should not be forgotten. And we are coming around to look at and evaluating how much energy that we are wasting in terms of materiality, in terms of making the walls not good enough to protect, insulate, and then creating the spaces just based on we're going to air condition it anyway kind of approach. Yes, I think we should be looking at those passive approaches more carefully and employ them in a modern way.
In the present building typology of multi-storied buildings, what is the scope of traditional techniques application?
Yeah, traditionally the buildings are not very high, except the the religious buildings or mosques. Even if you look at any place, for example, unless it's a memorial, it's a monument. Even in Hyderabad Charminar was the highest building at that time. Everything else was 2 floors. So again, the constraint was the materiality. So if you want to bring in the traditional way of, for example, passive cooling, yes, definitely you can do that in higher structures. You can inculcate the approach of vent walls or towers into a building where you actually bring in passive cooling down, and you can create atrium spaces that are cooled by the natural ventilation rather than artificially ventilating them. And some of the buildings actually looked at this in terms of orientation. For example, creating doubly constructed walls, but actually orienting the windows, etc., towards which doesn't face the direct solar heat gain. So you can create that. Of course, this is a basic technique that traditional buildings employed. They would locate the windows and doors towards the side where there is no direct sunlight, or they want to control the sunlight, they would have created the smaller opening. So this is the same kind of, you create the opening smaller in a high-rise building towards, for example, west or south in Kuwait. That's a basic adaptation of passive technology.
When we talk of vernacular architecture and the traditional architecture versus the West, because most of the time we see that we are trying to adopt whatever the West is doing. So how do you generalize the major key differences between the two?
I think West has evolved out of the economic situation, and when you look at the economic forces coming into picture, if you have to build and sell, or if you have to generate profit out of a particular building activity, then that takes over whatever you do. In terms of creativity, the creativity should sell. That's where the major difference comes in. Where in terms of how you do it, what you learn from either in India or here, you could really look at it. Of course, profitable, but at the same time, look at the energy saving that you would get from employing the basic traditional passive techniques of heating or cooling. And we have, while West has no basic foundations of their history, the history is very limited. We have a lot of continuous history in India right from ages. So if you have buildings that date back to 600, 700, 80. So you can look at those buildings and see what they have done in terms of protecting. Unfortunately, we don't have houses. We have only temples or monuments that are looking at it in a particular way. But if you study the houses and traditional houses, you would still see, you would employ those techniques into a modern context. And we could go back and relate to them. And basically, you as long as your concepts have developed on that approach, yes, we can do that. Whereas in the West, I mean, I would say a lot of Western buildings are outside in, where people just design a form or a shape that would sell, and then try to fit in whatever the programming that they have to do, and then try to solve the problems with that form. I think there are two very different approaches. I think in the East, what at least I've learned is inward out. You start designing from inside. You try to design your function that provides with less energy and reacts to climate and windows towards where you need to put them, and then try to bring out the form that did come about. So there are these two different aspects and approaches that very different. I see the West is more towards a formative approach.
When we talk of stone walls versus the ramped earth brick walls in terms of passive cooling techniques, which one would you rate as far as vernacular is concerned?
Again, vernacular falls back on what's available. So if you have stone available, right next to you, it's stone is the material that you go about. Whether you want to consider whether stone or mud is not a question. It's about what resource that easily available to you, and then brings about that. The stone walls, by the way, can be arranged to get you what your insulation rating that you want by creating voids in the stone. Many of these houses in Rajasthan also have been done in this way by creating voids between the arrangement of stones.
Okay, there is one more question. Permaculture farming is influence of vernacular, and how is it justified?
I'm sorry, I didn't get that question.
Permaculture farming, which is influence of the vernacular, how is it justified?
I'm not aware of that. Permaculture.
Permaculture farming. Okay, yeah.
Moving forward, I think, and in terms of practice, if I can say a couple of things in terms of practice after the educational aspect, when we create solutions by learning from the past or learning from the traditional architecture, we are probably perceiving it as, and even many of the students perceive it as stuck-on addition of features. We talked about mushrabia. I mean, some of these new buildings also create mushrabiyas just as a feature. Whether that serves the purpose or not is not really cared for, but it is a feature that they want to employ. So as long as we are cosmetic and we are just engaging to decorative elements or elements that create interest from the traditional architecture, it's not really promoting the core values of the traditional architecture. So it's a practice of facadism by having Jerokas. I created a traditional architecture. It is not. You're not really creating a traditional architecture by just adding Jerokas onto the facades. And we have to come out from this, as I said, branding the architecture as backward on traditional, and everything that is new and developed modern is good, and that's development versus what's traditional is past. We have to bring about that change in terms of thinking, and when students are inculcated with that, when they go into practice, they would generate a contextual approach to what they do. And I believe this is a learning process. When they learn about these techniques, or when they learn about the traditional architecture, and they want to design something, they always have that inherently to look at what's there, what's available around them in terms of street or where the site is. And we also teaching students to be the great architects, but at the same time, great architects come out with great baggage with them, because they want to be individualistic. They want to project themselves and show off their creativity in a way that being different is good. So I think we have to look at collectively in terms of what I'm doing in terms of practice, and what existed and what is my constraint, not just the money, but other constraints that are available on the site, and look at it in terms of uniformity. And many of these buildings in European countries, we know that an infill development is so much controlled and so much standardized. So you cannot really, your creativity is focused on to what you can do and what you cannot do, rather than just being different.
You have done a lot of restoration projects in Kuwait also. When we talk of the ancient buildings getting restored, in the absence of vernacular materials, what methods do you adopt?
Yeah, we have to actually bring in a contractor and train the craftsmen to do things for us. So there was a process where we have asked the contractor to bring in people who are already doing this kind of work, or we have to train them. For example, plaster work, how much plaster should be applied, or to do mud bricks, how do they do the mud? We have to recreate the whole process again and teach them before we actually move on to a restoration project. And documentation of what was there before actually helped us a lot, because when you document and series of posters or pamphlets were prepared for the contractor, you do this first, second step, and third step. He follows those. And some of the conservation architects, even in Hyderabad, I think they're very similar, because when you call in a contractor, he doesn't know what to do. So you have to really train those people and engage them to work with you. Otherwise, a simple, somebody's absence of that understanding or sensitivity will lack the entire restoration work.
When we talk of hands-on experience in terms of understanding the traditional architecture or the vernacular style, and I was just talking about this Auroville experience where students do go there, and a lot of workmanship has been ignored in India also. In India, and with respect to Kuwait, can you just suggest some, or throw some light on this as to how we can, get this as a better solution with you can include students, and the entire design pedagogy, if we talk, and make it more everything more, even the studio work, be it the adopting of the traditional style or whatever. Can we get more better experience with something which is ignored? What do you suggest for that?
Yeah, I think creating constraint is more important. When you have an open constraint, I mean, you design a house, for example, I think second year, third year studio, if you are looking at the design of a house and you don't give any constraints, then it becomes challenging for the student. And also he doesn't really have to go through an understanding of what I do here. So if you say the only available material for you is mud, and design a house, or the only available material for you is a reed and or the palm leaves, then you would probably get a very creative solutions with that approach. And unless you have a constraint, I mean, we are talking about not higher buildings, not commercial aspects, but we are talking about houses here. We are talking about common houses. People still in India, architects are working for probably the top rich percentage of society, rather than actually the middle common or lower middle society, where people build on their own. They will probably go to a mason to build their house and get it signed off by a licensed engineer. So you have to actually capture that. If you want to really capture that, that's the only way to look at saying, you would listen to what they are talking about, and you would understand what their constraints are in terms of economics, in terms of materials, and then the rest.
Fetching more people to conservation works is a tough task. What message would you like to impart to architecture students in this context?
I think conservation should not be considered as controlled. I mean, when we talk about conservation, we talk about keeping things as they are, keeping and restoring, and just preservation. I think there's a lot to learn. Again, for me, conservation is a learning tool to develop what you want to design. So there are different approaches in terms of what you can do, what you cannot do. When you do conservation as a course, when you study conservation, this is exactly what you're doing. You're trying to learn from the past what they did and how it is responded to a particular situation or a constraint. And when you do that, and you can greatly apply that to what you want to design. So my suggestion to the students in terms of conservation, going into conservation, first, they have a great opportunity to save a lot of buildings. I mean, there is a lot of work that's happening right now. There's a lot more awareness than 20 years ago about conservation. There are many agencies, both the public and the government, private agencies, actually looking at conservation architecture as specialists that are coming in. You can look at the Intact, so much work they have been doing. Also, the young architects that are coming in and actually looking at this as an opportunity for getting into the field. But apart from that, conservation should not be taken just for preservation of buildings. So I want to say that conservation is just a course of, you want to expand your architecture into a postgrad course. It should be taken as a course of a design work in context. How you design in context. This is a great opportunity to do that.
To gel with the present times, what kind of digital skills should a conservation architect have according to your understanding?
Oh, there are lots of developments on this front, and when we learned conservation, photogrammetry was the in thing. People talked about, and we were taught about how to create photogrammetry, using photogrammetry, how to create elevations into very minute detail. From that, we have progressed to now drones are in thing. You can actually go around the building with a drone without actually going there. Inaccessible places can be documented in 3D, in photography, or directly translate them into drawings. So there's a lot of development in that front. You have techniques of how what is inside a building, greatly accessible. People can now look at what's inside materiality or construction. That's without actually investigating or intervening with the structure. So those are the techniques which really help students or the professionals now to actually, without touching a building, you can document it.
I think that we can now conclude the session. Any takeaway remarks, the last remark that you would like to make?
I would really like to see the young generation of educators putting more into creating courses that study traditional architecture for students, and then I'm sure those students will carry this forward into the practice. That's a simple message I hope that would carry. Thank you.
Okay. With this, we conclude this evening session of today. And I would like to thank architect B.T. Srinivas for throwing light on very pertinent issues and for having patiently answered to all the questions which came up from the chat box and from the participants. Thanks to you, sir. And I would like to thank Dr. Padmavati, who is the brainchild of all these sessions. Thank you, ma'am, for this excellent putting up such a good platform. Thanks to my team, Madhu, Shrikant, for helping in the technical, managing the technical aspects. My team, Ruma, and everyone else associated with this. Thank you all once again. And we conclude the session.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye. Up such a good platform. Thanks to my team, Madhu, Shrikant, for helping in the technical, managing the technical aspects. My team, Ruma, and everyone else associated with us. Thank you all once again. And we conclude the session.
Thank you very much.
Thanks to my team, Madhu, Shrikant, for helping in the technical, managing the technical aspects. My team, Ruma, and everyone else associated with us.